our economic vitality in Chicago is in many ways extraordinary, right? We are home to more corporate headquarters than just about any city in the country. We are home to some incredible tech startups and food startups and this beautiful business ecosystem, but not everybody is engaged and included in that, and it really is leaving us all behind. What we really hope is that today is the beginning of new conversations, new possible potential partnerships around this use of data to inform our efforts to make Chicago better.
I'll just dive right in because I think everyone here is eager to learn. Maybe we will start with Curtis on this one, and how you use data to go beyond simply measuring, but toward creating and advancing change in communities.
So data, look, we're a bank, so the amount of data we have is infinite, right? And it's just a matter of how you use that data. We're also using that data to help community and drive policy. So our institute is intertwined with our corporate responsibility group and our policy group in terms of trying to understand what impacts, how people are spending, what demographics are affected, and what are some of the things that we can do as a bank to help either drive policy or help our consumers so that they can prosper and enjoy economic benefit in their communities.
So at the most basic level, and the one that you're probably most familiar with, we work with our grant partners. At the next layer of the kind of data that we think about at the Trust, we are a financial steward of other people's resources. So we think a lot about how are we using the money, how are we deploying as an organization. So how do we change the narrative that place-based investments it's not an either or, it's a both and. They are both good for the people that are benefiting from the services that are being provided, and they're having an economic impact.
Just to echo what Jen said, the place-based and looking at the neighborhood as a unit of change and the frequency of data, I think is something that's really evolving in this space. We found that high-frequency economic data became paramount for government, policy, nonprofits, everyone to understand what is actually happening across a neighborhood level.
What you mean by high frequency economic
Sure.
data? Sorry.
So yeah, if you think back and currently today, one of the ways you would get an understanding of the economy would be 6-month, 8-month economic reports. What's the job report? What was overall spending? And you typically see it in a lagging indicator, 6-8 months later.
Yeah.
Well, when things are happening so fast, it's too late. Businesses don't operate like that, right? So businesses have the data that Curtis said. So they have this high frequency data and understanding how things are shifting, and so they're able to adjust, understand much faster.
But Noelle, how's data play a role in your day-to-day and the goals that you're driving toward?
And so we're using, of course, your typical investment data, to invest these assets. But importantly, because we're trying to have a positive impact, we also have a pretty sophisticated impact measurement and management framework. And so we're really measuring the partner, so the investee that we're looking at, we're measuring their commitment to impact, we're measuring their intended impact, and then we're measuring how we can contribute and learn from this investment.
The willingness to, help a bootstrap size organization build that know-how sounds like a through line between you and builders, and I'm sure MasterCard.
North Austin Center, if you guys have not been, it is an amazing athletic after-school program that was built in Austin community on what was a vacant piece of land for 40 years. But one of the questions that we were having was, what are we learning? What do they need to know to build their business case, to raise more money? The data is telling us that the investment we made, that last dollar in investment that led to the opening of this infrastructure, is not only helping kids and families find community, but the businesses, since it opened a year ago, have generated $6.6 million above and beyond what would have been expected to spend. That's the data we need to have, that we are lifting up all these businesses.
I would just add, the rigor of what she just mentioned is exceptionally high. We actually look at neighborhoods that look alike and have similar factors to where the investment was made, so that we can isolate it. And we can say, yeah, even though the economy, everybody grew, or inflation caused this much across the board, but because this center was here, it had this much incremental lift. So we can be very precise and prescriptive and give Jen and hopefully Chicago Community Trust the power to bring data into conversation that hasn't been there before.
And so what we've done, I mean, we launched our $30 billion racial equity commitment, and the vast majority of that's around housing. And one of the centerpieces around that is how do we make refinancing and actually getting into a mortgage easier? And what we're finding is massive differentiation between black and white appraisal values. And so we're lobbying and trying to really turn over that industry because, again, if you're trying to refinance, you're trying to get into a house, and appraisal is an important piece of that.
I wouldn't have predicted that this conversation today would be happening against the backdrop of an increasingly intense national argument right now around DEI, around ESG. Anyone can jump in on this one, but talk about what role data can play in that debate, in that conversation about where we as a society are headed and the value of continuing to do this kind of investment to lift all boats.
I could start. You know, it is tough with the affirmative action ruling from the Supreme Court last year. We've had to change a little bit more around how we're phrasing things and wording things, but the essence of being committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, or as we call it internally, JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is still there. And so we're being very thoughtful in talking about groups that are in communities that are underrepresented, you know, and that kind of thing. But we're still collecting the data. But of course, it's one input into many as we make decisions.
But we have to remember to tell the stories, and the stories with the data are what is actually going to keep the narrative shift alive. And if we just do numbers, people are really good at glazing over them and discounting them and saying, but nationally, to Curtis's point, you know, inflation is going down and people are okay. But they're not okay in our communities. They're not bouncing back in the same way. They still can't get in. We have an affordable housing crisis. Those are the kinds of data. And for whom we are not thriving is always the question I hope we ask ourselves. Who is not thriving in our city? What do we have to do about that? What do we know? We know a lot between all of you and everyone sitting up here about the data that we have. Now we have to catalyze it and continue to talk about learning and growth.